Okay, hello everybody. I'm Mike. Thank you very much for the awesome introduction. I had also prepared an introduction, so I'm going to have to go through it because that's what I've got, right? So you're going to have to see the slides somehow. Okay, so I work for BBD. I work for the research and development team at BBD. I don't actually have a job title, and I think that's sort of by design. I do a bunch of different things. They haven't fired me yet, so I'm presuming that I'm doing something okay, but I can't put a finger on what it is that I do on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, when I find out, I'll let you know. I am a Google developer expert in web technologies. They also haven't really asked me to do anything yet, so I think it's more like a merit badge for web technologies, right? Good job. Sorry?
You might have some unread messages.
Okay, scratch that one from the record. Okay, awesome. And then I love community events. I love organizing community events, and I organize two. So the first one is very near and dear to my heart, which is josie.js. Sorry for the shameless plug. We have an awesome meetup happening on Thursday this week where we've got cool topics. So if you care about JavaScript, both client-side and server-side, and are curious, there's lots of very, very casual talks on some cool tech topics. The venue. So it will be at BBD. Okay, at the BBD offices. It's because it's easy to organize at home because we can just send an email and then food arrives. Okay, and then additionally, it's a relatively new thing, and we're trying to see how it works out long term, is we're organizing the Docker Johannesburg user group, which is pretty cool, and it's supported by Docker itself, and they sent us through some stickers. So if you're a sticker people, I can give you Docker stickers. Okay, so I've got quite a few. And yes, come through. We've got some awesome talks. There's lots of excitement about it. I'm assuming that there are a couple people in the room that either do DevOps or are interested in containerization. We recently had cool topics on Kubernetes and Docker Swarm, and we've got some cool topics coming at the beginning of March. All right, so that's enough shameless plug. Sorry, Candace. Cool. And then moving straight along, we're going to dig into what I'm here to talk about today, which is progressive web apps. So there's a lot of misinformation about progressive web apps. I don't know, does anybody have a clear grasp on what they are? Anyone? I don't. Well, I didn't before I started this train of research. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm trying to tie down what we mean, or what people mean when they say progressive web apps. And then secondly, there's lots of technology trends, right? There's lots of buzzwords. Is this just another buzzword? Can you just safely ignore it and then carry on with your daily lives? Okay, so starting off with what they are. I'm going to go to basically where they came from. And you're going to forgive me for reading a quote for a brief second. This is from the announcement of progressive web apps back in 2015, where two really smart people, Francis Berryman and Alex Russell, said they're apps that take advantage of new features supported by modern browsers, and I've redacted a bit, that let users upgrade web apps to progressive web applications in their native operating systems. I don't think that can get more vague. It doesn't leave me with a sense of what this stuff is. And I think they've got a very good idea in their head about what they mean when they say progressive web apps, but it doesn't necessarily translate out of that. So like digging in a little bit deeper, they realized that they needed to tie this down, and they brought down to basically three principles of what, and a lot of this is out of the Google stable, of what they think these progressive web apps are. So the first thing is that they're reliable, which means that they should load instantly and never show the dinosaur, even in uncertain network conditions. Okay, so that's pretty clear. So that's what they mean by reliability, is that it needs to be network tolerant, but it's a little bit vague as to what they mean by network tolerant. The second is it needs to be fast. Fast. Yay, fast. Everything on the web should be fast. It's a great idea. And what they mean is that it should respond quickly to user interactions with silky smooth animations and no janky scrolling. Okay, so by fast, you don't mean the page downloads fast necessarily, but you mean that the interactions need to be fast. Okay, so that's a little bit tighter. I can get that. And then the last one is that it needs to be engaging, okay, which needs to feel like a natural app on the device with an immersive user experience. And I'm sorry, but that's also a little bit vague as to what engaging is, right? Because it depends on the user, it depends on the app, it depends on the device. So that's additionally not very useful and not instilling us with confidence that this isn't just another buzzword. So moving on, there's additional further set of characteristics that they use to say, well, these are what progressive web apps are. These are things that they exhibit. And the first one is that they are progressive, which is it should work for every user regardless of browser choice. Now, this isn't a new thing, right? This is the big P in PWA, and we've been talking about progressive web applications in the sense of this progressive for a very long time. You know, sniff for new features, only use it if the browser has it, and degrade gracefully to make sure that you've got a good experience for as many browsers as possible. So there's nothing new there, but it is really, really hard to do, and we've been struggling for better part of the last decade to try and get this stuff right. Then they talk about responsive, another term that we know very well, which is to fit any form factor, desktop, mobile, tablet, or forms yet to emerge, which is one that I particularly love. So right, we need to respond for stuff that we don't really know what it could be, and we also kind of know what this is. This is sort of a solved problem in our space. We know we need to adapt our content to fit the situation. Okay, so that's cool. And then we start getting into the interesting ones. Connectivity independent. It needs to work offline or in low connectivity environments. So this is the first red flag that we say, okay, well, this is very different. We're talking about a web application that works offline. What does that mean? Opinion, it has to be app-like. It needs to feel like an app to the user with app-style interactions and app-style navigation. So that's another flag that says, wait, so my web applications, which have very much a scrolling document model, need to start having like an application aesthetic to it so that it feels like an app. It needs to be fresh, always up to date. Now that's one that puzzled me initially because I live and work on the web, so everything's always up to date, you know, unless you stuff something up from your caching. It's there, it's available. But this isn't talking about web anymore. This is talking about apps, and apps aren't always up to date. Okay? The software is not always latest. They need to be safe, served via HTTPS to prevent snooping and ensure that content hasn't been tampered with. Hopefully, yes, this is a thing. Everybody's sites are served via HTTPS, right? Right? All the hands are going up? Yes? Okay, I'm going to ignore the ones that stayed down because... Can you toss me that water over there? Sorry. Discoverable. Okay, so this is interesting. They are identifiable as applications, allowing search engines to find them. So that's a distinct requirement. Re-engageable. Make re-engagement easy through features like push notifications. That's very particular as to what characteristics it exhibits. Installable. Allow users to keep apps they find most useful on their home screen, on their device. Again, very, very particular. Now we're drilling down to what the stuff actually is. And then finally, linkable, easily shareable via URL, and do not require complex installation. This is not talking about web, because web is easily shareable by URL. This is, again, talking about apps. OK, so we've got a better idea of what these things end up manifesting as. Let's take a look at yes. We'll talk about that a little bit later, possibly, but let's save that for the end. OK, awesome. So we're going to start talking about some of the technology and design bits and pieces that allow us to do this stuff, right? So we're going to start off with the app shell, OK? And to start off with the app shell, I'm going to talk about what a loading experience on the web is like. So you've gone somewhere, and you're presented by a white page, a big white page. This is it. This is actually your loading experience. And then a little while later, somebody puts that on your page. And you're like, really, that's what I was waiting for. And then eventually, you get an application. Like, eventually, something arrives. And that's really not good enough. That's super archaic. That's Web 2.0, and we don't talk about that anymore, right? Those days have passed. A big part of progressive web apps and this whole movement is designing your web page to behave like an application shell of an app does. You build a Chrome and the plating around your app completely separate of the stuff that you deliver in it, if that makes any kind of sense. So we're talking about the bare minimum UI that allows your application to load virtually instantaneously on initial page visit and then systematically pump content in. And if you're honest about it and you look at the apps that you use, your Facebook was a big example a little bit earlier. Facebook does this, right, where they load up this thing that's basically empty, and then it starts filling it with your data. Twitter, much the same. And this distinction between shell and content allows us to, well, to make this distinction between shell and content, we have to ask 3 really, really important questions. So firstly, what actually does need to be on screen immediately? What UI components are key to our app, and what supporting resources does it actually need? Okay? And asking these components and applying Occam's razor to this stuff means that we can achieve 2 important distinctions. So firstly, we start talking about Chrome of your application in the shell versus the content. And this lets you hyper-optimize the 2 separately as separate concerns. So firstly, the shell of the application can then be minimized and optimized, and the content can be delivered in as expedient and efficient a way as possible. All right, so that's the first simple part, and that's something that doesn't really need any advanced technological stuff. We can do that with what we've got today. Okay? The second part is where we start introducing new standards. And the first thing we're going to talk about is service worker. Has anybody heard of service worker before? Okay, it's been around a little bit, but it's only really cusping now. The wave is breaking. And we'll talk more about that just now, about how the wave is breaking. But what is the service worker? Okay? So service worker is actually really well defined as a standard. So it is a JavaScript background worker designed for non-blocking access. So that means that it has no DOM access, and everything is done asynchronously by default. Okay. It also is not just a background worker in a separate thread from the foreground process. It also it also behaves as a network interceptor. So all network traffic that the page generates can go through the service worker, almost like a reverse proxy, if that makes any kind of sense, which is incredibly powerful when we see the patterns that it enables. It facilitates push notifications, because it can separately from the main browser thread keep track of server-side communications for WebSockets or whatever the case may be. Some of the new APIs that it supports is background sync. So it will say, well, I'll keep track of a queue of changes that you want to send to the server, and when there's connectivity, I'll send it, right? Like log messages. Or if you do want to save stuff offline, and then when you reconnect, have it just send through to your server on batch. This is stuff that, I mean, is like, it's heady stuff that previously, before this, wasn't feasible, and definitely not easy in a JavaScript or web space. And the nice thing about it is that this stuff is just all JavaScript. So if you understand how to write in the page and you understand what you're doing across the wire, you can do whatever it is that you need to do. So, I mean, let's look at a practical example. And the options are endless here. So this example is contending or competing between the cache and the service worker to ask for a resource. The cache, in this instance, is going to fail and say, cool, well, I don't have that resource. The service worker is going to go to the network by default, populate the cache, and then return the response to the page. So on second and subsequent requests for the same resource, and it could be an image, it could be data, this could be days later, it'll just serve the thing out of cache instantaneously, giving you an instant loading experience and instant data access experience. Okay. And there are more. You can have the 2 compete against one another. You can go service worker first and then cache. And then you can also use pre-caching, which is an amazingly powerful one. So we've loaded up this application with a service worker. It knows it needs a whole bunch of lookup data. Go and fetch that stuff. Keep it locally so that when I ask for it, it's already there. Okay. And then how this results is in 2 important facets that we care about. So firstly, reducing network traffic, so making our site more efficient at what it does. And then secondly, allowing this offline fallback. And you'll see that I scratched out offline fallback there because it's not a fallback. Our experiences we are going to start designing as offline first and foremost, right? First build it offline and then allow it to have some interactivity when it's available and accessible. Okay, so then, moving along, we're going to get to the app manifest. So this is an additional technology thing that's already out there. It's already something that you can do that identifies your progressive web app or your web application as being something that is an application. Okay. This allows, firstly, for the browsers to identify that this is an installable thing. I can save this thing. I can give you some additional experience above and beyond the Chrome. It lets you pick icons for the various form factors. It lets you specify colors, so what the default colors need to be to integrate with your operating system, depending on which operating system it is. Splash screens, so on and so forth, to try and narrow that divide between something that exists behind a browser tab versus something that has space on your home screen. And how this manifests, and this is a super old GIF. I'm sorry, I was lazy and I didn't create a new one. But this is a 2014 GIF of how they initially envisioned this stuff. That you would access the site, it would give you a little toast pop-up that says add to home screen, and then you'd be able to go to your home screen and just link straight through to it. And this is super old, so nowadays you can specify icons. You can specify the splash screen that gets displayed as well as colors, and you'll notice that, let's wait for it to go through again. Luckily, it's a short GIF. When it goes into the application, so as soon as they tap onto it, the concept of a browser is gone. There's no URL bar. Okay, well, it ends very quickly, but there's no URL bar, right? It should be transparent as to whether you're in an app or whether you're in a browser, even though you are technically in a browser.
Is that configurable? You can say...
You can, yes. You can, but the idea being to collapse those worlds. It is configurable. You can specify it. And this is super cheap to do. It's just a little bit of JSON that you put in parallel to your index.html. All right, and there's some important things here. So firstly, you can't be obnoxious about this stuff, right? You can't keep prompting, hey, install my app. Hey, here's this thing that I expect you to do. And in fact, so much so that the browser manufacturers are starting to take that with this API and others that we can give examples for, but it doesn't really matter, away from the pages, saying that they'll decide when they'll prompt you to add to your homepage. They're not going to do it on first visit, might be second or third, and they tweak those heuristics on subsequent browser downloads, and different browsers will behave differently. Okay, so why is that? Because on mobile, the user is king. You are not in control as the web app. The user is in control, and you can't ever take that control away from them. And this is a big mindset shift, right? I've got the server. This is my application. You're asking for my application via a URL bar. No longer, right? The user needs to be in control of the experience. Okay, which moves us on to user experience. So I'm by no means a UX expert, but it is a very important facet of what the browser manufacturers, and Google particularly, feels is distinctive of progressive web apps. So the first thing is something that we should already be doing, which is mobile-first design. This is established, right? We're doing that stuff. We're not designing for desktop first and then trying to smash it down into a mobile device.
Sorry, how is that different from response? Is that different?
Yes and no. So if you can design for a desktop first and respond to different form factors, but mobile first says the first form factor you cater for is not desktop, it's mobile. So you're going to progressively enhance your application to respond to more and more real estate, but the first class citizen is mobile. Okay. Communicate state well. This is something that we don't really do as web developers, right? When we were dealing with the front end. If you want to, any kind of state requires full page postbacks or things that communicate to our server. We don't really look for whether you've got features available. Okay? We don't really look to see whether you're offline or online, whether something's going to work beforehand. And unfortunately, as a part of this UX, you have to specify this stuff up front. You need to communicate what's going to happen with your application. Semantic markup, another thing that we really should be doing, right? So we can start queuing in applications, using buttons for buttons rather than divs that are clickable, right? Make sure we use our hyperlinks properly. Make sure that we use the sections aside, whatever the case may be. And the last is this point of jankiness. Does anyone know what jankiness means? Okay, so jankiness is a very particular measure of like UI lag when touching something and dragging it. And it's usually in context of scrolling. So when you touch dragging, scrolling, and it's got that poor performance and it starts stuttering and lagging, which is so common in browsers. That's not the browser's fault. That's our fault. We do that. And it's something that we need to take control of. And, you know, UX is just one of those things that you know what an app UX is like. You know what those design patterns are when you use it, and we need to start thinking in that sense. Start behaving to those user design metaphors. But I think I've spoken enough about UX. I'm now going to talk about performance. And this is where I really get worked up, because we perform really, really poorly on the web. And we're super lazy, okay? We are. We're spoiled. We say, well, on my machine, the app loads in under a second. Or even when I check on the dev environment or the production environment, it loads in under a second for me, okay? What's the problem performance-wise? Well, practically, that under a second doesn't manifest to just a scalar value, right? It's a range of values. So we might be there on the far left at being the far right. Sorry, I'm turned around. The far right being that our app loads in under a second, but practically, there's a whole range of people up to 10 seconds that have a really poor experience on our app, and that's not how we see it. So the way we see app loading and app performance needs to change to take this more holistic view of what it means in different conditions, different browsers. So then we talk about, okay, well then what does loaded mean, right? When is an application actually loaded? When is it done? And there are three interesting points that we care about. So firstly, is it happening? Okay, is something happening? Secondly, is it useful, right? So something's happened on the page, but can I see stuff? Can I read stuff? Can I consume from that page that you've given me? And then lastly, is it usable? Can I touch it? Can I move it? Can I interact with it? Okay? And to answer those three questions, there are three very important metrics that we then measure as a part of looking at web performance. So the first one is first paint. How long does it take before I actually start drawing stuff to a page? And we focus a lot on this as our loaded, but it's not really useful yet. So when we talk about useful, we talk about first meaningful paint. How long until there's some content drawn onto that page that is useful and meaningful to the user, right? That they get some value out of it. And then for JavaScript-heavy applications and progressive web apps, far more importantly, we care about when this thing is usable. So we care about time to interactive. How long until I can start pushing stuff, navigating, and interacting with the page, okay? And unfortunately, those numbers don't look promising. So going back to Alex Russell, who's an awesome guy, he says that JavaScript is your most expensive asset. On average, web pages download something between 4 and 6 megabytes of images, tons of stuff. But he's saying JavaScript is expensive, right? We think of those full hero images that the designers make us load as making our lives difficult and making our page load slow. But it's untrue, because JavaScript delays time to interactive. You can do without the hero image if you can interact with your application, if you can use it, okay? Monica always has amazing analogies, and this one I thought was particularly poignant for what it is for a page that loads too long. You know, making meaningful eye contact during the time until something's drawn on it. And I think that gives you that very good sense of when it's too long, right? And that means that we're looking at, typically, for our time to interactive goals for progressive web apps, being less than 5 seconds on first load, okay? After 5 seconds, I want to be able to hit something. And on subsequent loads, once you've primed, once you've cached stuff, I want to be able to do it in less than 2 seconds. And how this manifests, and there is a heuristic behind it as to how you get this on average bandwidth, but is basically we're looking at about a budget for JavaScript of 170 kilobytes. Okay, that seems fair enough. 170 kilobytes of text is quite a lot, except 170 kilobytes of JavaScript. Who's looked at the frameworks that they use and how big they are? Who's using Moment.js? Hey? Okay, there we go. Moment.js is massive. RxJS is massive. These things blow that budget almost by themselves. So there's no space for your code for it to fit within these categories.
But wouldn't you use things like server-side rendering to put out?
Okay, we'll cover that as a question afterwards, because it's, okay, but it's a good point. But even if you're looking at server-side rendering, you're already engaging with the performance of your application, right? And it doesn't make the problem go away in its entirety. So let's start looking at design patterns, and badly named design patterns. I'm sorry, like the purple pattern seems a little bit forced. But this is just taking the bits and pieces that we've discussed, so some pattern like the app shell, some technology like service worker and app manifest, and combining them in a cohesive strategy as to how we can get stuff efficient. So let's talk about what PRPL means, because obviously it's an acronym that stands for something. So first is talking about pushing critical resources on initial page load. The second is rendering those resources, rendering the initial load. Pre-caching everything else that your page is going to need so that it's fast subsequently. And then for the stuff that you don't really need or you're not sure that the user is going to need, lazy loading. And how you manifest this stuff is, firstly, if you're fortunate, if you're super lucky, you can use HTTP2 to send additional resources down on initial page load. We're not really that lucky yet. Or you can use something like link-rel preload, which says that when the index.html is hit, it immediately starts preloading all of these assets that it needs in a non-blocking fashion. Render initial root, that's the minimum app shell, right? Taking an absolute view of the bare essentials for your application and rendering that as a part of your initial page download, and then subsequently fetching your content. Pre-cache remaining roots, so setting up service worker to say, cool, I'm spun up, I'm loaded, I know I'm going to need this other stuff for the application to actually be functional later on. I'm going to need data or whatever the case may be. Go and fetch that stuff aggressively. Don't wait for the user to ask for it necessarily. And then lazy load on demand says, don't pre-cache everything. Figure out what is meaningful for your user, right? What can be deferred to a later point in time, and use advanced code splitting techniques like Rollup or Webpack to take those and split those bundles apart. Okay, so how this looks, because I mean it's very heady to talk about this stuff, and I've shamelessly stolen this from somebody's slides, so forgive me. But essentially, what we're looking at on the left-hand side is the stuff that is essential for that 5 seconds time to interactive. Everything on the right-hand side is for your application to be useful longer term. So essentially, we're deferring all of the lazy loading stuff to the right. We're pre-caching everything that is non-essential to the page to the right of that line. And to the left, we're focusing on, firstly, the initial page request, and then secondly, preloading as much of our critical resources as possible so the super expensive parse compile time, which we'll talk about in a minute, is optimized to get interactive as quickly as possible. So I think that neatly takes us to why should I care? Okay, you've told me a whole bunch of stuff, but I don't know whether this is a thing I should worry about, right? I've mentioned a lot of particular technologies and patterns, but I'm gonna split it in two, right? Because progressive web apps sort of sit at the intersection between web and mobile. They're trying to play in both worlds. So if we talk about from a mobile perspective, and I'm not a mobile dev, so please don't shout at me if any of this is objectionable. But for mobile, we're looking at how many devices are out there. So this is all devices, and there's about 5 billion connected devices on the internet, okay? And far higher percentage of those are mobile than desktop, and that's growing, whereas desktop is not. 13% of time spent on mobile is actually on web, and 87% of time spent on your devices is on native applications. However, interestingly, you only use about 10 applications per day, 10 native applications, on average. And of those, 80% of your time is spent on 3 applications, okay? On average, a user installs exactly 0 applications per month. All right. And the average download size of those applications is 15 megabytes on Android and 38 megabytes on iOS. So this is one for the Android guys to say, yay, Android is so awesome. 15 megabytes, guys. Like, it's still a lot, right? Particularly on bandwidth-constrained networks, or people who don't have a lot of bandwidth, right? Like developing nations, like us. So the takeaway from here, from a mobile perspective, is that the future is mobile. Undoubtedly, those numbers speak for themselves. And we'll talk about a local context just now. But the audience is incredibly discerning about what it is that they want to download and what it is that they want to use. Okay? It takes up space on your phone. It's, I am the king, and I get to decide which of these things I use. So it's a very contented space. So now we move on to web, right? And this is completely slanted, and you'll forgive me because I'm a web developer. But we're going to talk about performance. So in the 90th percentile, 90% of JavaScript sites are sending a megabyte of gzipped JavaScript down the wire, which practically manifests as about 4 megabytes of JavaScript when it gets ungzipped, which is 4 seconds of your precious 5-second time to interactive spent on just parsing and compiling the JavaScript before anything executes. And this is from HTTP archive. I can share the citation later on, and you can check those stats yourself. It's a thing, right? We are sending an insane amount of JavaScript that is wasted Because about 40% of that stuff never gets executed, never gets run on the page. So the average time to interactive on mobile is 35 seconds. Okay, and keeping in mind that this data predominantly comes from a European and American context where they've got good mobile networks, right? 35 seconds time to interactive, which is bad by comparison to our 5 second that we wanted previously. But after 3 seconds, the estimate is that you've already lost 20% of your user traffic, and it's exponential from there. So by the time you get to 35 seconds, you've lost vast majority of your engagements on your page. And the people that are left are the ones that really want to use your application. So what this means in a web context is that we are being super wasteful and super lazy, and we've just spoken about JavaScript, and it's hurting us, and we don't care, right? We're just going to do it anyway, and that's not good enough. So lastly, what does this mean in a local context, right? And finding data for this stuff in South Africa is really, really difficult. I haven't found, and I know of a couple that are being built, but I haven't found any local PWAs that are out in the wild yet. We've worked on one, and I know Simon Stewart is working on another one that is under such a tight NDA that he won't even tell me who it's for. But we can look at a holistic global and African context, right? So let's look globally at just the number of internet users. So there are about 4 billion internet users internationally, and about 400 million internet users in Africa, so roughly about 10%, and then about 30 million in South Africa, okay? Which is still quite a lot. And if we talk about it in terms of penetration globally is 52%, in Africa is 31%, and in South Africa is 54%. So superficially, it looks like the 54% is pretty good, right? But if we compare ourselves with penetration in the American and European context, where a lot of the performance data comes from, those numbers are 95%. So we still have a lot of room to grow, and Africa has a lot of room to grow. So these are all opportunities, people that are going to be our next generation of users. So let's talk about mobile a little bit more in sub-Saharan Africa, because that's all I could find data on, unfortunately. So in sub-Saharan Africa, in 2016, there were 420 million mobile users, or unique mobile users, and in 2020, they're predicted to have 535 subscribers, or million subscribers, not only 535, otherwise everyone would go out of business. This is the interesting one. So by 2020, there are going to be 500 million smartphones in sub-Saharan Africa. So the idea of the feature phone and it won't run the things that we need it to run is completely outdated, right? By very definition. By 2020, they're all going to be running really modern operating systems. And the growth on mobile web is predicted to grow from 26% to 38%, okay? So that's also incredibly significant, and that's just the beginning of that trend. So let's talk about whether this stuff is ready or not, right? Because that's the question, is that it's all good enough to talk about new technologies, but can I use it? Can I use it now? Okay? And I'm going to break it up by browser. Again, coming from a web background. So Chrome, Google came up with this stuff. They've got first-class support. They've got developing tooling. They've got improving APIs. So if you're on Android or Chrome, this is amazing. It's a great experience. And behind feature flag at the moment in the latest Chrome is using progressive web apps as standalone desktop applications. The exact same experience, but being able to install an application. And I mean, I know so many corporates that would love that, right? Firefox. Firefox has amazing support. They lag a little bit behind Chrome, obviously, because they're pushing forward the whole area. But they do. They support Service Worker. They support App Manifest. And they help formulate the standard. They're busy working on that background sync API that does the queuing and pushing to the server. They're working on it at the moment. OK, so let's get to the problem children, right? And the problem children, hey, and Andre's in the room. So Edge is not actually a problem child anymore. Microsoft's all in. They think that this is a great idea. So much so that the latest Edge supports Service Worker, and they're, in fact, going to look for app manifests as a part of their crawling and add all of those app manifests, all of those progressive web applications, to their app store. Now, the one argument is that's because they don't have anything in their app store. But I think it shows their commitment to the cause, right? They believe so much that this stuff is the future that they're prepared to populate it. And if we're honest and we look back at Windows, it was Windows 8 where they introduced JavaScript as a first-class citizen for WinRT. right? When JavaScript and HTML, they believe in this stuff. They've been trying to push this stuff, albeit in a different context. Safari. And the reason why Safari is important is because Android is covered, right? We're talking about mobile applications. iOS is not at present. WebKit, so the guys that do browser work at Apple, started development on Service Worker last year, and it's already landed in developer CTP this year. So just the fact that they're prioritizing the stuff to that extent, that you can already download a preview of Safari that has Service Worker baked into it, shows that they don't want to be behind on this trend, right? They care about this stuff. All of the browser manufacturers care about this stuff landing now. Not one day, not eventually. They need it now. So in summary, okay, and I'm going to make some contentious statements here. Okay, some opinions will be dropped. There is still no real clear definition of a progressive web app. And I look at this at the same way we talk about REST or RESTful, right? It's an architectural style of web application. And it's got characteristics, but as we'll see in the examples, those characteristics aren't uniformly met. And it doesn't mean that the thing isn't a progressive web app. It just means that it doesn't really care about offline first support necessarily, right? Or it doesn't care about being app styled. So maybe look at it as more of a spectrum, more of a buzzword. So secondly, I'm sorry, I think the installation is a gimmick. I, as a web developer, don't understand the difference between it being behind a browser tab versus being on my home screen. And I might be alone in this. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so perhaps I'm short-sighted, and perhaps the mobile guys will have a different opinion on this, but that's my opinion. Native mobile is not going anywhere. It is the best, richest, most engaging user experience. It's rewarding. It's here to stay, and we've got to accept that, right? And the numbers of the amount of mobile growth shows that. However, the stuff that sits in the middle, Cordova, hybrid mobile, things that are portlet-like bits that sit in between pure mobile and pure web, they're gone. That gap has been there, which is why we have stuff like Cordova, but it's gone, and it's going to be replaced by progressive web apps. And importantly, it's to say that some of your use cases might never have been served by a performant native application. I've written lots of Cordova stuff, right? In those examples, there's now a first-class tool for you to use, which is cool. It's useful. Web performance sucks, and it sucks so much, and it's such a big problem, and it's going to be such a bigger problem going forward that if you do not change, if you do not respect the stuff that's coming out now, the demand for the stuff to be faster and for us to be less wasteful, you will die. Okay. No, it will. No, it will. Your web applications will die. They will not be used. Okay. It's what it takes to exist on the web. Okay, maybe not literally die. Figuratively die. Okay. This is the thing. Okay, I went through all the browsers. They're all landing stuff now. Google's already landed stuff. Firefox has already landed stuff. And the rate at which Edge and Safari are trying to catch up shows that there's enough motivation behind this thing being a thing, that it is going to happen whether you're along for the ride or you're not. So you might not be all in with all of the features, but it is a thing. Okay, so I've got a couple examples. If anybody cares, I think we've got about 10 more minutes, approximately. Does anybody want to see any examples and ask questions while we go? All right, so let's take a look at the first use case, right? Which is Twitter Lite, okay? Oh, and there's the progressive web app experience. Because I forgot that I was off of the internet. So luckily I loaded it previously, and their app shell loads up, and they say, listen, we're really, really sorry, but we can't serve you any tweets. Because it's down, right? You don't have internet connectivity. Disappointingly, I can't see the tweets that were there previously, but I also kind of understand that there would be a lot of data, and I'd rather not see those tweets than have that take up space on my disk. This was not thought through. I need to get. Can I get onto the internet easily, Andre? No. Okay. Okay. MSFT guest. Okay. All right. No, it's OK. I don't think we've got enough time to struggle with connectivity issues, so we'll look at the other one. I'm not going to look at Google Maps Go, because for whatever reason, So this was something that was, oh, now it's doing something. WebAuth redirect. OK, so Google Maps Go, they've, how do I do this? Visiting guest? Can I visiting guest? Andre? OK. Yay, yay. OK. OK. We'll go back to Google Maps Go. So there's still teething issues with it, but the entirety of Google Maps is available as a progressive web app. Okay? App Chrome, service worker, efficient network caching. And there are still some teething issues, so there's no offline support, which there's supposedly supposed to be. And I didn't really get it working, unfortunately, but expect stuff to change. Like this has only been released to the public in the last couple of weeks. Okay? NASA Code, which I thought was quite a cute one, shows a full offline experience progressive web app that doesn't actually have any real data. But this is all of the links to the GitHub projects of NASA, right? So their actual code, which is pretty cool. And you've got navigation. So the whole site is interactable with, images, icons, tons of text. And to show you what this looks like, I'm going to go into the application tab. And here you can see the service worker is registered, right? That's the background thread. And I can't really see it or debug it because it's running isolated from the foreground thread. But it is there. So I can also see when it was updated, when it was received. And there are some idiosyncrasies around how to deal with service worker and how to design for service worker so that this stuff makes sense. And if you care about that, you should totally come to my DevConf talk where I show you how to do it in Angular. Was that good enough? Hey? Hey? OK. OK, let's segue. So that's an interesting point. So Angular has traditionally performed really, really poorly on progressive web apps because the application itself, also the framework itself, is really, really big. They're doing a lot of work on it right now. Does this load? It'll be amazing. Yes, this loads. OK. So who remembers To Do MVC? I've done so much stuff comparing frameworks with To Do MVC. And the next generation is Hacker News as a progressive web app, okay? Where they've got progressive web apps implemented in a number of frameworks. So React, Preact, multiple React implementations, Angular, Polymer, a whole bunch. So you can see how the different frameworks compare and how they compare from a performance score perspective. So if you take a look, sorry? It's hnpwa.com, hnpwa.com. So if you take a look at React Hacker News, for example, which was basically the first one that this came out with, you can see that it's got a Lighthouse score, which I'll see if I can show Lighthouse in a minute. It's got a Lighthouse score of 91. It shows that it's a time to interactive of 2.57 seconds on interactive emerging markets, which I think is basically a euphemism for Edge. And then probably 2G more than Edge. I don't think America knows that Edge still exists. And then interactive on 3G, okay, of 2 seconds. And then you can compare at the bottom here. Not at the bottom. There's tons. But you can look at Angular, which is 6 seconds and 4.4 seconds, so twice the time for the exact same application to interactive. Now, on your question, I know that the Angular team right now is working really, really hard at making this smaller. And the biggest problem that they've got is they've got a really comprehensive view templating engine. The new view templating engine allows for a fully functional Angular app, I think, in 3.3 kilobytes. Okay, so they're putting a lot of effort into this. Now, it's not going to be Preact levels of amazing. Let's actually look at Preact for a second. It's not going to be Preact levels of amazing, but we're going to talk about Preact, yes. Was it the second one? Oh, it was the second one, sorry. OK, it's not Preact, but hopefully it'll get super close, because Angular is still a big, chunky toolbox of a framework, right? And they're putting effort in. Preact is API-compatible React alternative that has all of the niceties around debugging and developer experience taken out. Okay, well, it's not taken out necessarily, but completely re-implemented to be far more targeted. The net result is that if you build a React application, however you may, at deployment time, you can just swap React with preact out and go from whatever 40 or 50 kilobytes down to 6, I think it is, which is how they can get their time to interactive to 1.5 seconds and 1.9 seconds, respectively. Okay. NPM uses preact. Yes.
Just wanted to ask a question on that service worker.
Yes.
On mobile, does it run in the background? So if I lock my screen, will that service worker keep running? Because I know in the browser, JavaScript doesn't run if you lock the screen.
Service worker does. Service worker does run, because how else are you going to get push notifications? Okay. So something to keep in mind. And it does respect, because it has to play by the device's rules. So it does respect however you've got your background applications running. But it'll run in the background the same way that a native app would. So if you switch it off, it's not going to. But if you allow it, it's going to do stuff behind the scenes. So again, that's something important to think about, right? Is that you might start draining user battery life, for example's sake. Right? And remember, the user is king, and he's going to uninstall your application. Because that's what happens, is I rage uninstall Facebook every couple of weeks because it takes too much battery. Yeah?
Having worked with Polymer, one of the recommendations is actually to use HTTP2 and service worker
Yeah.
without minification. Does it mean we're going to run away from minifying JavaScript?
Eventually, yes. And let's talk about why. And we're really off of progressive web apps for the moment. Well, not really, right? Why do we have minification of JavaScript assets? Because browsers request so many assets in parallel, and then the rest they queue. So it depends on the browser. Old school browsers have like 2 or 4, looking at you, i.e., and more modern browsers have like 8 that they request simultaneously. Now, that's why we bundle this stuff together so we can get that stuff down the wire as quickly as possible. But that's a queuing problem. Now, with HTTP2, where you can say, well, I want one request, and rather than just one request, one response, it's going to be one request, 10 responses. And I can deal with all 10 of those independently. Then why do I care about bundling? Minification might still be a thing, possibly. But we don't care about cramming all of that stuff together and all of the idiosyncrasies that come with that. And we can cache those files separately, right? And that is where it's going. So as soon as HTTP2 is ubiquitous, we're going to probably be doing that, but not today. Any other questions?
Like how much like storage space and processing power can you use in the background?
Okay. Storage space you can use quite a lot. I'm not actually familiar with the restraints around it, but I think it is relatively sizable, keeping in mind that it will be visible to the user how much space the thing is using if they go take a look. But you can do quite a lot, right? I think I'm standing under correction. I'll go double check and let the group know, but I think it's about 50 megs that it's fine with, which is quite a lot of data that you can put in. And you have first-class access to local storage via the service worker. Okay. Two more questions. No, at any point in time.
In terms of navigation style, also different browsers, different mobile devices have like back buttons or multiple.
Yeah.
Am I going to have to build my app to cater for that, or is there something that does that for me? Or?
So there are some style sheets that you can use, and there are also some frameworks that handle this pretty well. So what Ionic has become, so Ionic was the thing that built Angular into Cordova. They've moved away from that completely, and they've got something called Stencil.js, which is a web component progressive web app framework, completely going this way. And if you then end up using that, it has some of that abstraction taken away from you. It will render different style sheets on iOS versus Android, if that's your concern.
Just sorry, on the installation.
Yeah.
How does the installation happen? Am I having to put something on the store, or do you go to the browser and you get that like pop-up saying?
You go to the browser and you get the pop-up. So what Edge is going to be doing, or Microsoft is going to be doing via their robots, is they're going to pick up the stuff that is installable and put it in the store, but you don't have to go to a store. If you visit the same page several times, on the third visit, and this is people's thinking, they're still tuning it, but on the third to fifth visit, they'll say, hey, you use this thing quite a lot. Do you want to install it to your home screen? Yes, I would like to. And that's particularly to move away from the pattern where you open up a browser tab and nothing is rendered yet, and it says, this page wants to use your location. Does anybody actually say yes on that? Anyone? No. And then you have to go through a whole bunch of effort to re-enable it afterwards, right?
This side says, do you want to put on your home screen first time?
What, this one?
Yeah, PWA.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
That's obnoxious.
But it was cool because I wanted to test the PWA thing.
Awesome. A quick shout out to Lighthouse. If you want trying to understand how this stuff fits together and what performance stuff you can use on your actual application, use Google's Lighthouse tooling, which comes up with a score based on a whole bunch of different metrics, and it'll give you lots of help on performance tuning your front end. Okay, so it's really good tooling. Yeah, and besides that, I mean, I think that's all the questions. Cool, so I hope that was interesting.